Welcome to Old World Order Theology with Brian Newberry. Today's topic is going to be, what is the best form of government? You might ask, what does this have to do with theology? We're getting into politics now? Well, politics are merely the application of one's theology and or philosophy. And you really can't have one without the other, because once you have a belief about God and God as a person and God with moral attributes, you have to have a way to implement God's will in civil society, and we call that politics. And today I'm going to be reading from a book called On the Controversies on the Roman Pontiff by St. Robert Bellarmine. I really recommend this book if anyone wants to do research on the topic of the papacy. This book was originally published in the year 1577, 60 years after the Protestant Revolution, and St. Robert Bellarmine is countering many of the attacks of the Protestants on the institution of the papacy. And interestingly enough, St. Robert Bellarmine, he begins with the general form of government. What is the best form of government? And he begins with that to get into, okay, if X is the best form of government for general purposes of the civil world, then how then would be the best form of government for Christ's church, the ecclesiastical government? So I'm just going to be reading a few pages and offering comments on this. This is a 16th century document, so this is long before the French Revolution, democratic republics in the West, although they are ancient, going back to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And of course, St. Robert Bellarmine is familiar with those philosophers and even quotes them at length. St. Robert Bellarmine also, he counters a few of his opponents in this work, especially John Calvin, sometimes Luther, but Calvin being a much better theologian than Martin Luther and much more articulate. So he does mention Calvin quite often in many topics, and some others. So without further ado, let's get into it. The question is proposed, what might be the best system of government? And St. Robert answers, quote, "There can be no doubt that our Savior, Jesus Christ, could and wished that his church should govern by that plan and mode that would be the best and most useful. There are three forms of government: monarchy, that is, of one prince, the contrary vice to which is tyranny; aristocracy, that is, the rule of the best men, to which is opposed an oligarchy; and democracy, that is, the rule of the whole people, which does not rarely fall into sedition. The chief philosophers teach this, namely Plato and Aristotle, and they do so for a good reason. For if the multitude must be governed, it cannot be done without being governed in some way, according to those three modes. Either one is put in charge of the commonwealth, or some from many, or everyone altogether. If one, it will be a monarchy; if some from many, it will be an aristocracy; if altogether everyone, then a democracy." Close quote. Pretty simple, breaking it down into the three basic types of government, although you can make subcategories for each category. He just wants to simplify things by putting them into three categories. Now, here in the 21st century, we kind of just assume that democracy and republicanism are the best and should be used by everyone, because we've been using them for the last 200 years or so, which in reality is not a very long time in the span of human civilization. In fact, monarchy has the longest standing pedigree among all, and we shouldn't just automatically assume that monarchies are bad just because we've been taught that, and just because they've been in decline and are virtually non-existent in the world today, with a few exceptions. So we ought to give we ought to start from ground zero and give St. Robert Bellarmine and the philosophers their fair hearing. Let's try to be objective about this matter, shall we? Continuing, quote, "Moreover, although these three might only be simple forms of government, nevertheless they can be mixed among themselves, and from such a mixture 4 other forms of government are produced, one combined from all three, the second from monarchy and aristocracy, the third from monarchy and democracy, the last from democracy and aristocracy. That being so constituted, the first question arises, what might be the best form of government from those 7? Now, John Calvin, in order to altogether block every way in which one usually arrives by disputation to constitute ecclesiastical monarchy, places aristocracy and democracy before all other forms. An aristocracy from single forms, though in fact is a mixed form, a government tempered according to his own mind. Most of all, he wished monarchy to be regarded as the worst of all, especially if it were constituted through the world or in the church. His words from the Institutes are these," quoting Calvin now, "Should it be as they would have it, that it is good and also useful that the whole world be comprised by one monarchy, which is still very absurd, but should it be so, still I would never concede that it should flourish in the governance of the church." Close quote from Calvin. And again, Calvin says, "If in itself those 3 forms of government are considered which the philosophers posit, I myself can hardly deny either aristocracy or a form combined with popular government by far excels every other form of the state." Close quote from Calvin. Continuing with Bellarmine. Thereafter, he showed 2 arguments, one brought out from experience, the second from divine authority. Quote from Calvin, "It was always sanctioned by experience itself, not only because the Lord confirmed it by his authority, but even more in that aristocracy is the nearest to the form of government he established among the Israelites." Close quote from Calvin. Now Bellarmine goes, quote, "We, on the other hand, follow St. Thomas Aquinas and other Catholic theologians in that from the 3 simple forms of government we place monarchy before the rest, although on account of the corruption of human nature we reckon monarchy blended with aristocracy and democracy to be more useful for men in this time than simple monarchy, provided the first parts should be of monarchy. It should have the second aristocracy, and in the last place should be democracy. To be sure, in order that the whole matter can more easily be explained and confirmed by arguments, we will take up our teaching on the 3 propositions. The first proposition, among the simple forms the most excellent is monarchy. Secondly, blended government, including all 3 forms on the account of corruption of human nature, is more useful than simple monarchy. Thirdly, after we have excluded all other circumstances, simple monarchy simply and absolutely excels." Close quote. So St. Robert Bellarmine says that simple monarchy is absolutely the best, but he also gives contingency to human nature, fallen human nature, that in our current situation of the world, monarchy blended with some aristocracy, kind of like a court of nobles, and even some forms of democracy where the people have a voice, is the best, right? More efficient. I'm actually surprised how many Catholics cringe when I tell them that monarchy is the best form of government. It's because they cannot separate themselves from what their surrounding culture and their upbringing have really drilled into their minds that monarchies are bad, because otherwise kings can become tyrants and then the people are slaves to the king and so forth. And that's actually a teaching of John Calvin and the Protestants. Catholics just don't know their history very well, and they don't really know their political philosophy very well. It makes sense that John Calvin would deny a monarchy because he's against the papacy, right? So because the Pope is an ecclesiastical monarch, and Robert Bellarmine is arguing for that. So that's why he begins his entire book, which defends the papacy, with what is the best form of government. So when Catholics deny that monarchy, or when they outright scoff at it and laugh and don't even understand why, other than that's just what they've been taught, they're actually agreeing with John Calvin and the Protestants, as you see. So that's, Protestantism, it was all about authority. That's the underlying premise of Protestantism, is that I will not have anyone rule over me. I can decide for myself what God wants for me and what the Bible says for me, and I don't need a magisterium or a pope to tell me otherwise. So it's a form of sedition, just as Robert Bellarmine said that democracies often become. So let us continue. Chapter 2 in the book, the first proposition is proved that simple monarchy is superior to simple aristocracy and democracy. Quote, "Let us proceed from the first. We do not especially compare monarchy with mixed forms of government, nor do we place it before all mixed and simple forms. But we assert this: if some simple form of government must necessarily be chosen, without a doubt monarchy should be chosen. Now we will prove it by these arguments. Firstly, of the old Hebrew, Greek, and Latin writers, theologians, and philosophers, orators, historians, and poets agree with this opinion. First, we look to Philo from the Jewish theologians, praising the teachings of Homer." Quoting from Philo now, quote, "that for many to command is evil. There should be one king, for rule pertains not to citizens and men more than to the world and God." Close quote from Philo. Among the Greeks, Blessed Justin teaches that the rule of many is harmful, and on the contrary, the rule of one is more useful and beneficial. Quoting from Justin, I'm assuming Justin Martyr, maybe not. Quote, "The rule of one is truly freed from wars and dissensions and is usually free." Close quote from Justin. Also, St. Athanasius, "Truly we have said that a multitude of gods is a nullity of gods. So also necessarily a multitude of princes makes it that there should appear to be no prince. However, there is no prince, there is confusion, is absolutely born." Close quote from St. Athanasius. So you see, they're all saying that democracy is the worst form of government because everybody cannot rule without a lot of dissension, arguments, gridlock, right? We witness that in the American government, how nothing ever gets done because Congress and the Senate are always arguing with each other and nothing really gets done. And then they try to write these bills of law that have a bunch of pork in it. So that's why no one can pass them, because the title, the main premise of the bill might sound good, but it has all these other attachments to it and so forth. So a simple monarchy by the ancients, almost unanimously, is the best form of government. It's also interesting to note that in the French Revolution of 1789, with which priests, nuns, and nobles were beheaded in the streets, they had two enemies in mind that they wanted to conquer. First and foremost was the Catholic Church, and the second was the monarchy. So it's interesting, the enemies of the Catholic Church were also enemies of the crown. They hated the church and they hated the king. So it's interesting how Catholicism and monarchy go together. Let's continue with St. Robert. Quote, "Among the Latins, St. Cyprian teaches the same thing, and he proves it most eminently from the very fact that monarchy should be the best and most natural government, because God is one." Quoting from St. Cyprian, "For the divine authority let us borrow from an earthly example. In what way has an alliance of power ever begun with trust or ended with blood?" Close quote. St. Jerome says, "One emperor, one judge of the province. When Rome was built, she could not have two brothers as kings at the same time." Lastly, one can consult St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, from the philosophers, Plato says, "One dominion has been arranged for good laws. The law of these is best. That governance in which many command we ought to esteem as the middle. The administration of many others in all matters is weak and also frail." Close quote from Plato. Aristotle followed Plato, and after he enumerated these three forms of rule, he added these words, quoting from Aristotle, "A kingdom is the best of these, a republic the worst." Close quote from Aristotle. Seneca said that Marcus Brutus did not act with sufficient prudence when he killed Julius Caesar in the hope of liberty, and giving the reason, he says, "Since the best state of the citizenry is to be under one just king." Next, Plutarch wrote a whole work on monarchy and on the rest of the forms to rule the multitude, in which he expressed his opinion. Quote from Plutarch: "If the choice of electing were conceded, one should not choose anything else than the power of one." Close quote. And again, Plutarch wrote the same thing on Solon of Athens, when he said that at Athens many seditions arose when democracy flourished, and immediately adds, quote, "One method, however, appeared to be left over to safety and quiet, if matters would have been brought to the rule of one." Close quote. Among orators, Isocrates, in that oration which is entitled Nicocles, contends to show this very thing for many reasons, but John Stobaeus marked it down in the title Hoti Kaliston he Monarchia, and also in that discourse of Hesiod, Euripides, and Serenus, Ecphantus, and many others. He produced testimonies to confirm this very thing. Herodotus, in the Histories, Book 3, which is titled Thalia, when he brought to light the slaughter of the Magi, who had occupied the kingdom of Persia, also shows the disputation that was held among the princes on establishing a republic. He had departed from their disputation, and after shaking off those opinions of those who strove for aristocracy or a commonwealth by the consensus of all, with only one exception, monarchy was judged to be the most useful and excellent. On that account it was retained in Persia. Thereupon, among the poets, Homer, in Book 2 of the Iliad, advanced that opinion celebrated by nearly all writers: Huc agathon polocio ranin, es quairanos, esto es basileus. Calvin responds to that testimony of Homer, whose opinion alone among so many he objects to, says, quoting from Calvin now, "It is easy to respond. Monarchy is not even praised in this sense either from the Homeric Ulysses or from others, as if one ought to rule the whole world by means of authority. But they wish to indicate that a kingdom cannot take two, and power, as he says, is an impatient consort." Close quote from Calvin. But certainly if it was easy for Calvin to respond, it is easier for us to respond to Calvin. For either he says nothing, or he says that what we say, or he speaks falsity and contradicts himself. If, when he says one kingdom cannot have two men, he means to place the force on the word kingdom, and means a kingdom properly so called cannot take two men, since if there were two, there will not be a kingdom properly so called, since a kingdom is properly the supreme power of one man, then really Calvin says nothing altogether, but only spreads darkness over the inexperienced by the ambiguity of words. For to say in that sense, a kingdom does not take two, means the same as if someone would say the rule of one is not the rule of two, and one man is not two men. Nothing in this pronouncement is due to the wisdom of Ulysses. Close quote. So Calvin took a quote out of one of Homer's work, where we're saying a kingdom cannot be ruled by two, as interpreting Homer by saying that a monarchy is bad, when in fact he's just saying that a kingdom cannot be ruled by two, because obviously a kingdom proper is ruled by one. Pretty simple. Continuing with Bellarmine, quote, "Yet if he does not put the force on that word, but rather he understands by kingdom the multitude who should be ruled, then he says the very thing which we are saying. On this we assert that monarchy excels a commonwealth and aristocracy, because the multitude is not ruled agreeably by many, and power is an impatient consort." Close quote. So he's basically saying, when he says power is an impatient consort, the mob cannot rule the many, right? So 51% should not rule the 49%, especially if they're not prudent in political matters. And as we can see from our political climate today, the rule of many is not working. Everything's kind of just falling apart, right? Everybody's protesting. In America, we have more rights and freedom than any other country in the world, but yet they're still not satisfied. They want more. And they're saying the very country that gave them the rights is bad and evil and needs to be changed into something else. So St. Robert Bellarmine's words, Plato's words, Aristotle's words are coming quite true. Continuing with St. Robert, quote, "If therefore Calvin means for a kingdom to be understood not as a multitude, but some individual province or one scanty kingdom, that the sense might be that one king is to be given to one province, nevertheless he is not to be judge of the whole world, then he speaks falsely and contradicts himself. For the Homeric Ulysses does not dispute over establishing a republic in some individual province. Rather, he spoke to the whole army of Greeks, who were then fighting at Troy, in which army there were many nations, many princes, and many kings, and he affirmed it was not fitting for the whole multitude to be ruled by many, but by one. Therefore the sense of this famous passage can be none other than, in whichever individual multitude you like, there ought to be one primary ruler, because he holds place equally in a scanty kingdom, and in the greatest command. For in one scanty kingdom there ought to be one king, not because it is scanty, but because it is one." Makes sense. It's kind of like that old saying, the further you get to the top, the further eventually one man calls the shots, right? The farther up you go, it eventually comes to one person who makes the executive decision. So even in the Senate, in the United States Senate, there's the vice president is the tie-breaking vote, right? So in that sense, he's a type of monarch. Continuing with St. Robert, quote, "For this reason, if some kingdom was great, as was Assyria, or that of Cyrus, or even of Alexander or Augustus, it was one. It ought to have one prince, and seeing that the church is one, there will be no end of his kingdom. And in the days of their kings, the God of heaven will rouse, because he is not overthrown. On that account, there even ought to be one king." Next, Calvin even opposes himself. Accordingly, not only does he consider that a monarchy over the whole world would not be advantageous, but not even over some individual city or the church, as is clearly gathered from Book 4 of the Institutes, where he bestows all ecclesiastical power upon a body of elders, and from the same book, where he praises those cities which, having thrown off the yoke of princes, are governed by senate and people, as the Republic of Geneva. Therefore, since Calvin leaves no place for monarchy, he himself saw how well he ought to respond to so many and such serious authors who praise the opinion of Homer. Another reason is deduced from divine authority, which shows in three ways that monarchy is the best system of government. The first, by the establishment of the human race. God made from one every kind of man, as the apostle says. Indeed, he did not produce both men and women equally from the ground, but man from the ground and woman from the man. Showing the reason for this, St. John Chrysostom says that this is so, that there should not be democracy among men, but a kingdom. And certainly, if many men were produced from the ground at the same time, they would all have been equally princes over their posterity. Were that the case, we could rightly doubt whether the rule of one pleased God. But now, since he made the whole human race from one, and he wished every one to depend on one clearly, it appears to mean that the rule of one is commended more than the governance of many." Closed quote. So he makes the argument because God is one, and he rules everything, and he created the human race from one man, and not even man and woman together from the ground equally, but woman from man and man from the ground. So it is a hierarchy and a monarchy. And that is why those who are very anti-Christian, they hate monarchy, they hate hierarchies, and they really hate patriarchy, right? Because all this comes from God. And you can see how violent and vile they are in their protests, their riots, and so forth, throughout history, not just in today's events. Continuing, quote, "Next, God showed his opinion, not only when he inserted the natural propensity to monarchical rule among men, but even among nearly all things. There can be no doubt whether the natural propensity must be referred back to the author of nature. Moreover, he even declares that in some house, naturally the governance of the spouse, children, servants, and all other affairs naturally pertains to one head of the household. It is before all other forms of government, the rule of one. In like manner, a great part of the world is governed by kings," at least in 1577. "Apart from that, monarchy is by far older than the system of republics. In the beginning, the rule of nations and empires was in the hands of kings." That's from Justin. Therefore it appears all living things aspire to the rule of one. St. Cyprian speaks thus: there is one king for bees, one leader among flocks, and one rule among rams. So now they're getting into natural law and nature, showing how monarchy even rules over nature. St. Jerome adds, and cranes follow one by the order of the litter. Calvin, however, mocks these testimonies, for he says, on this matter, if it please God that they offer proofs from cranes and bees, who always chose one leader for themselves, there cannot be many proofs. Rightly, I accept the testimony they give, but do bees from all over the world merely choose one king? In their beehives are contained individual kings, so also in cranes each flock has its own king. What else does this evince than that to teach church ought to be attributed its own bishop? Close quote. So Calvin's position is that the local bishop is independent of other bishops and rules in his own right. Continuing with St. Robert, quote, this response from Calvin is easily refuted, for the church is as one sheepfold, St. John chapter 10, not many sheepfolds. Thus it can also be called one beehive and one flock. And on that account, just as there is one king for bees, and cranes follow one in the rank of the litter, so the universal church ought to have and follow one leader and primary teacher. Thereupon cranes and bees are not of that nature that they can unite when they are absent, and placed far away from the union of spirit. And on that account it is little wonder that they do not flock together throughout the world to choose one king. And in this matter, that each of their flocks have their own king, shows clearly enough that the government of one is natural. For if we evince that from these examples brought from very authoritative fathers, as Calvin says that to each church ought to be attributed its own bishop, why will he not suffer bishops, except maybe in name only, but instead attributes all ecclesiastical power to the body of elders? All of these aside, the form of rule which God himself wished to confirm by his authority can be gathered here chiefly from that state which he established amongst the people of the Hebrews. He did not, as Calvin says, but cannot prove, make the government of the Hebrews an aristocracy or a government of many, but was plainly a monarchy. The princes among the Hebrews were first of all patriarchs, as Abraham, Jacob, Jude, and the rest. Thereupon generals as Moses and Joshua, then judges as Samuel, Samson, and others. Afterwards kings as Saul, David, and Solomon. Thereafter again generals as Zerubbabel and the Maccabees. Further, the deeds of the patriarchs show they were provided with royal power. Abraham waged war against 4 kings, and we do not read anywhere that he received full power from any senate, nor any decree from such a body. Judah judged his daughter-in-law, who was accused of adultery, with fire, and he did not consult or ask any senate. Moses, as a true and supreme prince of the Jewish people, commanded many thousands of Jews to be killed on account of the golden calf, which they had erected in one day. We do not read of any decree of a senate, or that a plebiscite is held. The same thing can altogether be said of the judges, who received no faculty from the senate or the people, and waged wars that they wished, and gave men over to be killed. Certainly Gideon, after the victory of the Midianites, killed 70 men in the city of Succoth, and destroyed the tower of Phanuel. Next, over the fields and those who attended them, the leaders of the Jews were entrusted with a supreme and also royal authority that is so clear that it is not necessary to prove. Therefore, it remains to be seen where Calvin read that the government of the Jews was by the aristocrats and the people, not usually governed by any one particular prince. By chance, one will object that we have in the first book of Kings of Samuel, chapter 8, where the Israelites are reproved by God because they demanded a king. For if God was not pleased to establish a king for their government, how believable is it that generals and judges were established by God with royal power? We respond, someone can be put in charge of a state with supreme power in 2 ways. First, as a king and lord, who depends on no one. The second, that for a king or a primary general, someone is indeed in charge of the whole people, but who nevertheless is himself subject to a king. Therefore God had in this second matter established the government of the Jews in the time of generals and judges, that he should, without any doubt, be the proper and particular king of that people, and nevertheless, because they were men and lacked a visible ruler, and one whom they could go to and appeal, he placed before them some man as for a king, who by no means depended upon the people who were subject to him, but upon the true king, God alone. Hence to Samuel, they have not cast you off, but me, lest I should rule over them. And with the apostle, St. Paul, Moses was faithful in the whole of his house as a slave. Close quote. That was from Hebrews chapter 3. So usually the argument goes that from 1 Samuel, which is also called 1 Kings in the ancient times, in chapter 8, where it appears that God was very unhappy with the Israelites for demanding a king, because he says, they have not rejected you, Samuel, they rejected me. But Samuel was a type of vicar for the Lord, because he was the judge of the people. So the people were rejecting, yes, God, of course, as their ultimate king, but they were also rejecting Samuel as the vicar or the viceroy of the Lord, who was their visible ruler, right? See where I'm going with this? So in the same way, Jesus Christ is the king and the head of the church. But similarly, the Pope, or the successor of St. Peter, and St. Peter alone was given the keys of the kingdom of God, is the vicar of Christ, the king, and the viceroy. So he's the visible head of the visible church. But ultimately, yes, God is the king. So if God is the king and God wills on earth what is in heaven, then it makes sense that a monarchy is the best form of government. And I had an earlier video on this titled, Does God Prefer a Monarchy?, in which I give the biblical proof of monarchy being the best form of government. But I figured I needed some more proof from the doctor of the church, St. Robert Bellarmine, or one of the doctors. And when a doctor of the church speaks on a matter, he's not infallible, but he ought to be listened to. So here, Robert Bellarmine is giving biblical proof to back up the philosophers and other saints that monarchy is the best form of government. Continuing, quote, however, because the Jews were not content in this state of government, they wished to have a king in that prior manner, who not only should command all as one, but even make generals and judges, and even should possess the whole kingdom as his own, and transmit to his sons and grandsons the inheritance. On that account they were rightly condemned and castigated by the Lord. Nor did that desire of having their own king so displease God that he commanded them to apply a rule by many, or to adapt to the spirit of aristocracy. Rather, he designated a king as the best for them, and afterwards saved and protected both their king and their kingdom for a very long time, until it remained as a duty. Close quote. So, I mean, God himself, he did choose Saul to be king, although Saul was more the choice of the people's choice. He based that on human contingencies, but King David was the prototype and the ideal king of Israel, and that's the one God himself anointed and chose. So can God choose something that is immoral? No, he cannot. And again, he reproves the Israelites because they wanted a king to rule over them like the other kings of the world, in the manner of other kings, and not in the ways of the Lord. Continuing with St. Robert, quote, the last reason follows, which is deduced from the enumeration of those properties that everyone holds, makes the best government, in fact. That first property is order. In the very matter, if it is a better government, it is because it has been more ordered. However, monarchy is more ordered than aristocracy or democracy. Thus it can be proved. All order has been placed in it that in some man should be in charge, others should be subject. Nor indeed is order recognized among equals, but rather among superiors and inferiors. Where there is monarchy, there all things altogether have some order. When there might be no man who is not subjected to someone, excepting he who has care of all things. For this reason, there is a supreme order in the Catholic Church, where the people are subject to their pastors, pastors to bishops, bishops to metropolitans, and metropolitans to primates, primates to the supreme pontiff. the supreme pontiff to God. But where governance is in the hands of aristocrats, indeed the people have their own order when they are subjected to the aristocrats, but the aristocrats have none among themselves. Democracy lacks order in a far greater degree, since all citizens are of the same condition, and they are all judged to be of authority in the commonwealth. Close quote. So, I mean, that makes sense, right? So, if you have a hierarchy of magistrates, if you have a hierarchy of people in charge that eventually gets to one man, then that's a monarchy, right? An aristocracy, you have nobles and citizens, lords and serfs kind of thing, but the aristocrats themselves have to decide among themselves, and if they can't decide, then you end up with gridlock and nothing happens. And then when you have a democracy in its truest form, and every individual is an authority, it's even worse. Nothing can get settled. And that's very unnatural. Chaos is inevitably will happen with democracy, and even with aristocracy eventually. So if you have an established monarchy with some kind of constitution or tradition that holds the king accountable to, then that's much more doable in the current state of humanity. Continuing, quote, another property is the acquisition of its proper end. There cannot be any doubt whether that form of ruling, the multitude would be better and more fittingly and easily acquires its proposed end. The end of government, however, is the unity of the citizens among themselves, and peace, which that union appears principally to be centered on, that all might think the same, wish the same, and follow the same. They will obtain it much more certainly and easily if one must be obeyed rather than many, for it can scarcely happen that many, of whom one does not depend on the other, might make judgments about matters in the same way. Therefore, when there are many who rule the multitude, then one or another commands something, or will not suffer someone, or in various pursuits, the people necessarily become divided. But this can scarcely happen when it is the duty of only one to command. Close quote. So now he's speaking about unity. Unity, when ruled by many, is impossible, because you have so many different opinions by individual autonomous rulers. You will not have any kind of cohesion or order in society. And unity is very important, and even more so in the church. When you read the New Testament, unity is a very central theme with Jesus and the apostles. So that can only be happened if you have some kind of monarchical rule of the church. And of course we have St. Peter as the chief of the apostles, and the successors of St. Peter, the popes, follow in his footsteps. Continuing with St. Robert, quote, use confirms the same thing, and experience is the teacher of things. Accordingly, in ancient Rome, under the kings, dissensions are rarely read amongst the citizens. After the kings were expelled, however, when a magistrate governed the republic for many years, it was a rare year in which the patricians did not contend with the plebeians, and at length they progressed even to civil strife, so that in a certain measure that most powerful republic perished at its own hands. It even happened that there was never a greater and longer peace enjoyed in the Roman state than under the Emperor Augustus, who established the first stable monarchy at Rome. The third property is strength and power of a state. That governance which is the judgment of all, excels the rest, is the one which makes the state more powerful and stronger. It is a stronger state in which there is a greater peace and concord among the citizens. Indeed, the combined strength dissipated among them in itself stronger, but a greater unity is where all depend on one than where they depend on many. As was proved above, consequently monarchy makes both a stronger state and is itself the best government. Experience agrees. Accordingly, from the four greatest empires, three rose under kings, obviously the Assyrians, Persians, and Greeks. The Roman Empire is the exception, which rose under popular domination, but even then they could not preserve it in the great disturbances of affairs without a dictator, that is, a king established pro tempore. Afterwards it flourished under Augustus more than it had at any other time under the Republic previously. The fourth property is stability and long duration. Certainly it cannot be denied that the government is better which is more stable and long-lasting, but monarchy, not aristocracy or democracy, endure the longest. But if it is a question of external force, we already showed that without a doubt it is stronger than the rest. Close quote. So he goes into properties of why monarchy is best, right? So you have unity, you have power and strength, and then you have stability and longevity. Now, Americans, we like to believe that our form of government is the best in the history of the world, with 3 co-equal branches and balance of power. But in reality, it doesn't really work that way. It doesn't work all that well. And we've only been around for 230 years or so, almost 250. And in the history of the world, 250 years is not really that long of a time. And our republic is surely dying as we speak. So perhaps we need to follow in the footsteps of the ancient Roman Empire and go into and hire an emperor to solidify the country and bring back order. Continuing with St. Robert, quote, "Now it remains to be seen whether monarchy is less given to emergencies and change than any other form of government, than there being no external force applied. It is so proved. Every kingdom divided against itself will be destroyed, as Christ says in St. Matthew. But it is more difficult for monarchy to be divided than any other form of rule. It is divided less easily because it is more one. But being more one, it itself is a simpler oneness than the multitude agreeing as one. Though truly the monarchy is one in itself, and naturally nothing is other than one, still the multitude agreeing as one is only one from its character. In itself it is many. Therefore monarchy, which depends upon one man, can be less easily torn asunder or destroyed than aristocracy or democracy, which depends upon the multitude agreeing as one body." Close quote. That makes sense. It's easier to destroy a democracy. All you have to do is spread out propaganda and have the people fighting against each other, which we see right now. Aristocracies, same thing. All you have to do is find some dividing line between the aristocrats and you can have them fighting amongst themselves, and then the people suffer. It's really hard to do that with a monarchy because the king, even if he is a bad king, he cannot be divided against himself. Continuing, quote, "For example, the monarchy of the Assyrians from Ninus to Sadarnaptum endured for 1,240 years without interruption, 1,000 years longer than America, as Eusebius teaches in his Chronicle, or 1,300 as Justin gathers in Book 1, or beyond 1,400 as Diodorus wishes us to believe. Thus this kingdom so endured that there was always a son as successor of the dead king in the kingdom, if it is true what Velleius Particulus wrote in the first volume of his history. But in the kingdom of the Scythians, which is held to be the oldest of all, could not be destroyed by any external enemy, as Justin writes in Book 2, nor was it dissolved in itself at any time, for around thousands of years that kingdom stood. There is no republic which is ever as long-lived or as stable. Certainly, the most powerful republic of the Romans could scarcely count 480 years, as many years from the expulsion of the kings, even to the reign of Julius Caesar. But under the monarchs in the East, from Caesar even to the last Constantine, it endured for 1,495 years without interruption. In the West, however, from the same Caesar even to Augustulus, around 500 years, and from Charlemagne even to the present emperor, it had been nearly 800 years. But for the 480 years that democracy flourished in the Roman Empire, the republic was not always ruled in the same manner. From the beginning, yearly consuls were created, a little after they added tribunes. Then the consuls and tribunes were taken up, creating a decemviri. After a year these were thrown out, and again the consuls and tribunes were recalled, not rarely, even dictators, and as many military tribunes were brought in with consular power. Therefore, no one form endured so long, nor could they all reach the age of noble kingdoms together. Some, by chance, bring up the Venetian Republic, which counts about 1,010 years, yet that has not even attained the years of the kingdom of the Scythians or the Assyrians. On the contrary, not even the kingdom of the Franks. And what is more, it is not a republic, where aristocracy is mixed with rule by many, the form which Calvin praises, but an aristocracy mixed with monarchy. Democracy has never existed in that city. of Venice. The fifth and last property is the facility of governance. Indeed, it relates more to whether it can be obtained easily and not with difficulty, that the state should be well governed. That it is easier for the state to be ruled rightly by one rather than many can be proved from these reasons. Reason number 1. It is easier to find one good man than many. Thereupon, it is easier for the people to obey one than many. On that account, magistrates which take turns and govern a state for a short time are often compelled first to lay aside a duty, then plainly recognize the business of the state. On the other hand, a king who always exercises the same office, even if from time to time he is of a meager intelligence, nevertheless by use and also experience is better than many others. Reason number 2. In like manner, yearly magistrates look after a business of the state, which is not their own, but a common and foreign to them. A king does so as properly his own. It is certain that it is not only easier, but even more thorough for one to care for his own things than for others. Reason number 3. Where there are many who rule, it can hardly be the case that there would be no rivalry, ambition, and contention present, and in point of fact, it does not rarely happen that some impede others, and effect that those who govern the affairs at hand will administer the commonwealth badly. In such a case, it is better for them to receive glory in abundance when they exercise the magistracy. But monarchy, which does not have anyone it might envy, or with whom to contend with in governance, more easily moderates all things. Lastly, to the extent that in great households, where many servants are assigned to the same duty, they manage their business badly, because one shall leave behind a common duty to another. So even where there are many heads of state, one looks to another, and while each one throws back the burden of his colleagues, no one sufficiently employs diligent care to the state. But a king that knows all things depend upon himself alone is compelled to neglect nothing. And also, hitherto, it is indeed proven that simple monarchy is better by far than simple aristocracy. Closed quote. So, the next chapter he goes in that monarchy mixed with aristocracy and democracy should be more advantageous in this life than a simple monarchy. So, St. Robert Bellarmine does concede the fact that we live in a fallen world of sinful men, and sometimes kings can become evil tyrants and dictators, and there should be a check and balance against that. So he argues in the next chapter that if you have a class of nobles, if you have a monarchy with an aristocracy, those who advise the king and maybe even have some kind of veto power in extreme cases of abuse by the king, that would be more advantageous than a simple monarchy in this life. Although the king, as the executive prince, will ensure that the kingdom is stable. So the last few arguments, he's saying that republics and democracies, they actually neglect the state because they're so busy arguing with each other and positioning themselves to see who's more powerful. So when you have a king, that's not an issue because the king is more powerful than all. So you don't have the kind of interfighting that we see today with Republicans and Democrats and other forms of government around the world. You don't have that with a monarchy. So it makes sense. You have Jesus Christ the King, and you have one ruling in his place, one over civil affairs and one over the church. It makes sense. So we're going to end there. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like and share. And if you haven't already, check out my other video, Does God Prefer a Monarchy?, where I make more of a biblical case for the matter. St. Robert goes a little bit deeper than I, so I thought that this was a good kind of sequel to the first one, and it gives more supporting evidence that monarchy is the best form of government. Please feel free to comment if you disagree. Feel free to comment. God bless you. Nomine Patris, Filii, Spiritus Sancti. Amen.